The machete glints in the moonlight. Around you, 300 men stand in complete silence. No torches, no voices, just breathing. Heavy, controlled, angry. Someone's hand grips your shoulder. You look over. His eyes say everything his mouth doesn't. Tonight, we die free, or we don't die at all. A whistle cuts through the darkness. Then, chaos. That scene? That wasn't a movie. That was April 14th, 1816, Barbados. And what's about to happen will be one of the largest, most brutal, and most erased slave rebellions in Caribbean history. But here's the thing. You've never heard of it. Not in school, not in any textbook, not even in Black History Month presentations. Because this story, and dozens like it across Brazil, Jamaica, Guyana, and the United States, was systematically buried, rewritten, and erased from mainstream history. Here's what they never told you. And I'm warning you right now, what you're about to learn will make you furious. Let's zoom out for a second. When we think about slavery, we think about suffering, we think about chains, we think about cotton fields and auction blocks and the Middle Passage. We think about victims. And yeah, enslaved people were victims, absolutely. The horrors they endured were unimaginable. But there's another side to this story. A side that terrified slaveholders so badly they spent centuries trying to erase it. Enslaved people fought back. Not occasionally, not symbolically, constantly. There were over 300 documented slave rebellions across the Americas. 300! And those are just the ones we know about. Historians estimate there were hundreds more that were never recorded, never written down, never acknowledged. Why? Because every single rebellion was a threat to the entire system. Every uprising proved that enslaved people weren't just enduring their oppression, they were resisting it, strategically, violently, fearlessly. And that terrified the people in power. So they did what empires always do when the truth threatens their control. They buried it. But here's where this story gets even crazier. These weren't just random acts of desperation. These were organized military campaigns, with leaders, with strategy, with intelligence networks, with weapons. Some of these rebellions almost succeeded. Some of them changed the world. And almost all of them were led by people whose names you've never heard. Until today. Because we're about to pull back the curtain on the biggest, bloodiest, and most suppressed slave rebellions in history. Starting with one that nearly wiped slavery off the map entirely. Let's start with the one rebellion you might know about. But even if you've heard of it, I guarantee you don't know the full story. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. Picture this: Saint-Domingue, a French colony, modern-day Haiti. And at the time, it was the richest colony in the entire world. Richer than the 13 American colonies, richer than Jamaica, richer than all of Brazil's gold mines combined. Why? Sugar, coffee, indigo, and 500,000 enslaved Africans working themselves to death to produce it. The mortality rate was so high that slaveholders didn't even care about keeping people alive. They just imported more. It was cheaper to work someone to death and replace them than to let them live long enough to resist. But that strategy backfired. Because in August 1791, a man named Duddy Bachman, an enslaved voodoo priest, held a secret ceremony in the forest of Bois Caiman. Under a lightning-streaked sky, he made a blood pact with the other leaders. The God of the white man calls him to commit crimes. Our God asks only for good works. But this God, who is so good, orders revenge. He will direct our hands. He will aid us. Throw away the image of the God of the whites who thirsts for our tears. Listen to the voice of liberty that speaks in all our hearts. 1 week later, the northern province exploded. Plantations burned, slaveholders fled. The entire colonial structure collapsed overnight. And here's the part they don't teach you. The enslaved forces won. Not just won a battle, won the war. They defeated the French, then the Spanish, then the British, three of the most powerful empires on earth, all at the same time. By 1804, Haiti became the first black republic in the world, the first nation born from a successful slave rebellion. But here's what makes this story even more powerful. The Haitian Revolution didn't just free Haiti. It terrified every slaveholding nation on the planet. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote "All men are created equal," refused to recognize Haiti as a country. Why? Because he owned over 600 enslaved people, and he knew that if the Haitian Revolution inspired rebellions in the U.S., his entire world would collapse. So the U.S. didn't recognize Haiti until 1862, 60 years later. France made Haiti pay reparations for freeing themselves, 150 million francs, the equivalent of $21 billion today. Think about that. They forced Haiti to pay for the crime of winning their freedom. And even today, most history classes barely mention Haiti. They'll spend weeks on the American Revolution, but Haiti gets a footnote. Why? Because teaching the Haitian Revolution means teaching that enslaved people could organize, strategize, and win against the most powerful militaries on earth. And that's a dangerous lesson. But Haiti wasn't the only place where enslaved people rose up. Not even close. In fact, while the Haitian Revolution was happening, there was another rebellion brewing. One that almost sparked a revolution across the entire American South. And it was led by a man whose name should be as famous as George Washington. But it's not. Let's talk about Gabriel Prosser. Virginia, summer of 1800. A 24-year-old blacksmith named Gabriel is working in a forge just outside Richmond. He's 6'2", literate, brilliant, and he spent the last year secretly organizing the largest slave rebellion in American history. Gabriel wasn't just planning a riot, he was planning a war. His plan? Recruit over 1,000 enslaved people, arm them with swords he'd been forging in secret, march on Richmond, capture the governor, take the armory, hold the city hostage until slavery was abolished in Virginia. And if that didn't work, burn Richmond to the ground and retreat to the mountains to fight a guerrilla war. This wasn't a desperate act. This was strategy. Gabriel studied the American Revolution. He knew the colonists had won against the British. He believed enslaved people could do the same. And he almost succeeded. By late August, Gabriel had recruited over 1,000 people. They had weapons, they had a plan, they had a date, August 30th, 1800. But then, on the night of the rebellion, something happened that changed everything. A massive thunderstorm. Rivers flooded, roads washed out, bridges collapsed. The rebellion had to be delayed. And in that delay, 2 enslaved men, terrified of what would happen, told their enslavers about the plot. Within hours, the Virginia militia mobilized. Gabriel and 27 other leaders were captured, tried, and executed. Before he was hung, he was asked if he had anything to say. He looked at the crowd and said, "I have nothing more to offer than what General Washington would have had to offer had he been taken by the British and put to trial by them. I have ventured my life in endeavoring to obtain the liberty of my countrymen, and am a willing sacrifice to their cause." Then they hung him. He was 24 years old. But here's what they don't tell you. Gabriel's rebellion terrified the South so badly that Virginia passed laws making it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. They tightened patrols. They increased punishments for even talking about freedom. Because Gabriel proved something the slaveholders didn't want anyone to know. Enslaved people weren't passive. They were waiting for the right moment. And that moment almost came. But you know what's wild? Gabriel's rebellion wasn't even the bloodiest uprising in the United States. Not even close. There's another one that makes Gabriel's plot look small. And it's the one rebellion that slaveholders spent centuries trying to erase from history. August 21st, 1831, Southampton County, Virginia. A man named Nat Turner walks into his enslaver's house at 2 a.m. He's not alone. 7 men follow him. No one speaks. They move through the darkness like shadows. Within minutes, the entire household is dead. And this is just the beginning. Over the next 48 hours, Nat Turner and his growing army, eventually over 70 people, will sweep through Southampton County, killing every white person they encounter. Men, women, children. By the time it's over, 60 white people are dead, and the entire South is in a state of absolute terror. But here's what you need to understand. Nat Turner wasn't a random killer. He was a preacher, a prophet, a man who believed he was chosen by God to bring divine justice to a system built on human suffering. Turner had visions. He saw black and white angels fighting in the sky. He saw blood on the corn. He saw signs everywhere that the time for liberation had come, and he acted on it. The rebellion was crushed within 2 days. White militias and federal troops hunted down Turner and his followers. Over 100 black people, most of whom had nothing to do with the rebellion, were killed in retaliation. Nat Turner hid for over 2 months before he was finally captured. At his trial, they asked him if he regretted what he'd done. He said no. They hanged him on November 11th, 1831. Then they skinned his body and turned his flesh into souvenir purses. Let that sink in. They were so terrified of what he represented that they desecrated his body and turned him into a trophy. But here's the part that makes this even more chilling. After Nat Turner's rebellion, the South passed even harsher laws. Enslaved people couldn't gather in groups, couldn't be educated, couldn't move freely. And Northern abolitionists, people who opposed slavery, were horrified by Turner's violence. William Lloyd Garrison, one of the most famous white abolitionists, condemned Turner. He said the rebellion was counterproductive, that it would hurt the cause of abolition. But Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man and one of the greatest voices for freedom in American history, saw it differently. He said, "The slaveholders themselves were responsible for the violence. They created the system. They perpetuated it. And now they were reaping what they had sown." And he was right. Because Nat Turner's rebellion wasn't just about vengeance. It was about freedom. And it terrified the South so badly that they spent the next 150 years trying to make sure no one remembered his name. But while the U.S. was busy erasing Nat Turner from history, there was another rebellion happening thousands of miles away, one that was bigger, even bloodier, and even more successful. And it took place in a country that had more enslaved people than any other nation on Earth: Brazil. January 25th, 1835. Salvador, Bahia, Brazil. It's 2 a.m. A group of over 600 Muslim enslaved Africans, mostly Yoruba and Hausa people, gather in secret. They're dressed in white robes. They carry swords, knives, and clubs, and they're about to launch one of the most organized urban slave revolts in history. This is the Malê Revolt, and it almost overthrew the entire city. Here's the context. By the 1830s, Brazil had imported over 4 million enslaved Africans, more than any other country in the Americas. The entire economy ran on their labor. But Brazil's enslavers made a critical mistake. They allowed enslaved Africans to maintain their cultural and religious identities: Yoruba, Hausa, Islam, and that created something powerful: community. The Malés, Muslim Africans, didn't just share a faith. They shared a language, a network, and a plan. For months, they met in secret. They organized. They recruited. They smuggled weapons. And on the night of January 25th, they struck. The plan was simple: take control of Salvador, free every enslaved person in the city, kill or expel every white colonizer, establish an independent black Muslim state in Brazil. For hours, the Malés fought through the streets of Salvador. They clashed with police. They stormed government buildings. They moved with precision and discipline. But they were outnumbered. By dawn, Brazilian troops crushed the rebellion. Over 70 Malés were killed. Hundreds more were arrested, tortured, and executed. But here's the part they don't teach. The Malê Revolt sent shockwaves across Brazil. The government was terrified. They realized that enslaved Africans weren't just laborers, they were a threat. So they responded with brutal crackdowns. They banned African religions. They broke up Muslim communities. They increased surveillance on enslaved people. And they buried the story. Today, most people in Brazil don't even know the Malê Revolt happened. Why? Because teaching it means teaching that enslaved Africans were organized, intelligent, and capable of nearly overthrowing an entire colonial system. And that's a truth Brazil didn't want anyone to know. But Brazil wasn't done yet. Because before the Malê Revolt, there was another rebellion in Brazil that was even more successful. One that created an independent black state that lasted for almost a century. And it's one of the greatest stories of resistance in human history. Imagine this. Deep in the mountains of northeastern Brazil, hidden in dense jungle, there's a city. Not a camp, not a village, a city. With over 30,000 people, farms, markets, schools, a government, an army. And everyone there is free. This is Palmares, also called Quilomboso dos Palmares, and for nearly 90 years, it was the largest and most successful community of formerly enslaved people in the Americas. Here's how it started. In the early 1600s, enslaved Africans in Brazil began escaping from plantations and fleeing into the mountains. They formed small communities called quilombos, independent settlements of freedom fighters. But Palmares was different. Palmares wasn't just a refuge, it was a nation. By the 1650s, Palmares had grown into a network of villages spread across hundreds of square miles. They grew crops. They traded with nearby indigenous groups. They even traded with some Portuguese colonists who were willing to do business. And they defended themselves fiercely. The Portuguese sent multiple military expeditions to destroy Palmares. Every single one failed. Why? Because Palmares was led by brilliant military strategists. The most famous was a man named Zumbi. Zumbi wasn't just a leader, he was a legend. Born in Palmares in 1655, Zumbi grew up free. He learned to read and write. He studied Portuguese military tactics, and when he became a leader, he transformed Palmares into an unstoppable guerrilla force. For decades, the Zumbi and his fighters defeated Portuguese armies over and over again. But by the 1690s, the Portuguese were desperate. Palmares was an existential threat. If it continued to exist, it proved that enslaved people could build their own societies, that they didn't need white colonizers. So the Portuguese hired a brutal mercenary named Domingos Jorge Velho. He brought a massive army, thousands of soldiers, cannons, and indigenous allies. In 1994, after months of siege, Palmares finally fell. Zumbi escaped. For over a year, he fought a guerrilla campaign from the jungle. But on November 20th, 1995, he was betrayed by one of his own men. Portuguese soldiers ambushed him. They killed him, beheaded him, and displayed his head in the town square as a warning. But it didn't work. Because even today, over 300 years later, Zumbi is a hero in Brazil. November 20th is Zumbi Day, a national holiday celebrating Black resistance. And Palmares remains one of the greatest symbols of freedom in history. But Palmares wasn't the only Quilombo in Brazil. There were thousands, and one of them, in the late 1700s, launched a rebellion so intense that it almost brought down the entire colonial system in South America. Let's talk about the Berbice slave uprising, and this one happened in Guyana. February 23, 1763, Berbice, Guyana, a Dutch colony. An enslaved African named Cuffy stands in front of 3,000 armed rebels. Behind him, Dutch plantations burn. Smoke rises into the sky. The entire colony is in chaos. And Cuffy has just declared himself governor of Berbice. This is the Berbice slave uprising, and it's one of the most successful and most forgotten slave rebellions in history. Here's what happened. In 1763, Berbice was a Dutch-controlled colony on the northern coast of South America. It was small but profitable. Sugar, cotton, coffee, all grown by enslaved Africans who were worked to death. But the enslaved population outnumbered the white colonists 20-1. And on February 23rd, they rose up. The rebellion was swift and brutal. Within days, enslaved Africans had taken control of dozens of plantations. They killed overseers, they armed themselves, and they began organizing a new government. Their leader was Cuffy, a man who had been enslaved on a plantation but quickly emerged as a brilliant strategist. Cuffy didn't just want revenge, he wanted freedom. He sent letters to the Dutch governor offering a truce. He proposed dividing the colony in half. The Dutch could keep the coast, and the formerly enslaved people would control the interior. The Dutch refused. So Cuffy prepared for war. For over a year, the rebellion held. The Dutch sent reinforcements from neighboring colonies. They brought soldiers, they brought ships, they brought cannons, but the rebels fought them off. However, internal divisions began to fracture the movement. Some rebels wanted to keep fighting, others wanted to negotiate. Tensions grew. Cuffy, exhausted and heartbroken by the infighting, reportedly took his own life. By 1764, the Dutch finally crushed the rebellion. Hundreds of rebels were executed. Hundreds more were hunted down in the jungle. But the Berbice Rebellion changed everything. It proved that enslaved people could not only fight back, they could govern. And today, Cuffy is a national hero in Guyana. His statue stands in the capital. February 23rd is a national holiday. But most of the world has never heard his name. Now let's go back to where we started. That moonlit night, that machete, that silence. Barbados, 1816. Because this rebellion was one of the largest in the Caribbean history, and almost no one knows it happened. April 14th, 1816, Barbados. A man named Bussa, an African-born enslaved man working on the Bailey's plantation, gives the signal. Within hours, over 400 enslaved people rise up across the island. They burn plantations, they destroy crops, they fight back with machetes, torches, and whatever weapons they can find. This is Bussa's Rebellion, and it's one of the most significant uprisings in British Caribbean history. Here's the context. By 1816, Britain had abolished the transatlantic slave trade, but slavery itself was still legal in British colonies. Enslaved people in Barbados heard rumors that the British government had actually abolished slavery entirely, but that the plantation owners were hiding it from them. This wasn't true, but the rumor spread, and it sparked a rebellion. Bussa, along with other leaders like Nanny Grigg, an enslaved woman and spiritual leader, organized the uprising. Nanny Grigg was brilliant. She used her position as a domestic enslaved person to gather intelligence. She learned which plantations were vulnerable. She spread the message, "Freedom is already ours, we just have to take it." On the night of April 14th, they struck. For 3 days, the rebellion raged. Enslaved people fought British troops across the island, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. By April 16th, the rebellion was crushed. Bussa was killed in battle. Over 1,000 enslaved people were killed or executed in the aftermath. Nanny Grigg was captured and executed. But here's the truth they don't want you to know. Bussa's rebellion terrified the British so badly that it accelerated the abolition movement. Within 20 years, Britain abolished slavery in all its colonies. Bussa's rebellion didn't just fight for freedom, it achieved it. And today, Bussa is a national hero in Barbados. His statue, the Emancipation Statue, stands at the center of a major roundabout in Bridgetown. But for over a century, his story was buried. Now let's head to Jamaica, because Jamaica had more slave rebellions than almost any other colony in the Caribbean. And the most famous one was led by a group of people who created their own nation in the mountains, the Maroons. Imagine you're a British soldier in 1730s Jamaica. You've been ordered to march into the Blue Mountains to capture a group of escaped enslaved people. You're confident. You have guns. You have training. You have numbers. But as you enter the jungle, something feels wrong. The forest is silent. Too silent. Then, suddenly, crack. A gunshot. One of your men drops. You spin around. Nothing. Just trees. Another shot. Another man down. You're being hunted. And you don't even know where the enemy is. Welcome to the Maroon Wars. The Maroons were communities of formerly enslaved Africans who escaped into Jamaica's mountains and formed independent societies. They weren't just hiding, they were thriving. They built villages, they farmed, they raised families, and they defended their freedom with ruthless guerrilla warfare. The British tried to destroy them over and over, and over they failed. The Maroons had something the British didn't: knowledge of the land. They used the jungle, they set traps, they launched ambushes, they disappeared into the mountains like ghosts. For decades, the Maroons fought the British to a standstill. Finally, in 1739, the British did something shocking. They signed a peace treaty with the Maroons. The British recognized the Maroons as a sovereign people. They gave them land. They gave them autonomy. Why? Because they couldn't defeat them. But there was a dark side to the treaty. The Maroons agreed to stop accepting new runaways, and in exchange for their freedom, they agreed to help the British hunt down other escaped enslaved people. It's a painful compromise, one that historians still debate today. But here's the undeniable truth. The Maroons proved that enslaved people could not only escape, they could build nations. And some of those Maroon communities still exist in Jamaica today. By now, you're probably starting to see the pattern. Everywhere slavery existed, resistance existed. But there's one more rebellion we need to talk about, one that's almost completely erased from history. The German Coast Uprising, Louisiana, 1811. January 8, 1811. A sugar plantation outside New Orleans. An enslaved man named Charles Deslons stands in front of nearly 500 armed rebels. They carry axes, cane knives, muskets stolen from plantations, and they're about to march on New Orleans. This is the German Coast Uprising, and it's the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. You've never heard of it. Here's why. In 1811, Louisiana was just bought by the United States. Slavery was booming. Sugar plantations stretched for miles along the Mississippi River, and the enslaved population was angry. Charles Deslondes, a mixed-race enslaved driver, had been planning this rebellion for months. He recruited across multiple plantations. He organized a military structure. He planned a route to New Orleans. On the night of January 8th, they struck. The rebels marched down River Road, burning plantations, freeing enslaved people, and killing overseers. By the time they reached the outskirts of New Orleans, they numbered between 300 and 500 people. But they never made it to the city. U.S. troops and local militias intercepted them. The rebels fought back fiercely, but they were outgunned. Over 100 rebels were killed in the battle. Charles Deslondes was captured, tortured, and executed. His body was mutilated and displayed as a warning. Dozens of other rebels were tried and executed. Their heads were placed on pikes along the river as a message to anyone who dared resist. And then the U.S. government buried the story. For almost 200 years, the German Coast Uprising was almost completely erased from history. Why? Because it was too close, too big, too organized. It proved that even in the United States, the so-called land of the free, enslaved people were willing to die for their liberation. And that was a truth the United States couldn't afford to acknowledge. So here's the question. Why were all these rebellions erased? Why do we know about the American Revolution, but not Gabriel's rebellion? Why do we know about the Civil War, but not the German Coast Uprising? Why do we know about the Boston Tea Party, but not Bussa's rebellion? The answer is simple. Because the system didn't want you to know. Slave rebellions weren't just violent uprisings. They were proof that enslaved people were never passive victims. They were revolutionaries. They were strategists. They were freedom fighters. And teaching that truth threatens the entire narrative that slavery was an inevitable, unchangeable system. It wasn't. Enslaved people resisted from day one. They fought back constantly. They built nations. They waged wars. They won wars. And they were erased from history because their stories were too powerful. Think about it. If schools taught the Haitian Revolution the way they teach the American Revolution, what would that mean? It would mean teaching that black people defeated 3 European empires and created the first free black republic. If schools taught Gabriel's rebellion the way they teach the Boston Tea Party, what would that mean? It would mean teaching that enslaved people organized military campaigns with the same strategic brilliance as the Founding Fathers. If schools taught Palmares the way they teach the Pilgrims, what would that mean? It would mean teaching that black people built a thriving, independent nation for nearly a century without white colonizers. That's why these stories were buried. Because they flip the narrative. They show that the people who were enslaved weren't waiting to be saved. They were fighting to save themselves. And that's a truth that challenges everything. So why does this matter today? Because the erasure of these rebellions didn't stop with history books. It continues. When we don't teach these stories, we perpetuate the myth that black people were passive in their own liberation, that freedom was given to them by benevolent white abolitionists or governments. But that's not what happened. Freedom was taken. It was fought for. It was won. And when we erase that truth, we erase the power, the brilliance, and the courage of millions of people who refused to accept their oppression. We also erase the blueprint for resistance. Because these rebellions weren't just historical events. They were strategies. They were models. They were proof that oppressed people can organize, resist, and win. And that's a lesson that's just as relevant today as it was in 1791, or 1831, or 1816. Every time someone tells you that change is impossible, that the system is too big, that resistance is pointless, remember these stories. Remember Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution. Remember Gabriel Prosser and his strategic brilliance. Remember Nat Turner and his unshakable conviction. Remember Zumbi and Palmares. Remember Kufi and the Berbice Uprising. Remember Bussa and the fight for freedom in Barbados. Remember the Maroons who built nations in the mountains. Remember Charles Deslandes and the German Coast Uprising. Remember the Malés who nearly took Salvador. These weren't just rebellions. They were revolutions. And they prove that no system of oppression is unshakable. So here's the truth they don't want you to know. Slavery didn't end because people in power decided it was wrong. It ended because enslaved people made it impossible to continue. Every rebellion, even the ones that failed, chipped away at the foundation of the system. Every act of resistance made slavery more expensive, more dangerous, more unsustainable. And eventually, the system collapsed, not because it was dismantled from above, but because it was destroyed from below. That's the story they erased from history. That's the story you were never taught in school. But now you know. And now that you know, you have a choice. You can let this story stay buried. Or you can share it. You can talk about it. You can research it. You can teach it. Because the erasure of these rebellions wasn't just about the past. It was about the future. It was about making sure that future generations never learned what's possible when people refuse to accept their oppression. But we're not going to let that happen. Because these stories will be told. These names will be remembered. And the truth will come to light. Because history doesn't belong to the people who tried to bury it. It belongs to the people who fought for freedom. And it always will. If this video made you feel something, share it. If it made you angry, share it. If it made you think, share it. Because these stories need to be told. And the more people who know the truth, the harder it is to erase. Drop a comment with which rebellion shocked you the most. And if you want more hidden history that will change the way you see the world, hit subscribe. Because we're just getting started.